Great, webinar is recorded now. Okay, so we have 30 minutes here today, and I will start with a short overview of PFAS and then the movement. And after this, Jonathan will give you an overview of what's happening in legislation, and then we look at some takeaway messages from today. And at the end, we will finish off with a Q&A. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box. Questions that are written in the chat are unfortunately not saved. So please type all questions in the Q&A box. And you're also very welcome to send us an email after the webinar if you prefer that. Okay, next slide, please. So, quick overview of PFAS. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and it's a group of approximately 5,000 chemicals. There are various estimations, but we base this on the definition given by the OECD. They are persistent, mobile, bioaccumulative, and toxic, and they can spread via air and water. They've been manufactured since the 1950s, and they're favored for their durability and well-functioning properties like non-stick, water repellents, and anti-grease. And they can be used in many different kinds of products, including firefighting foam, cosmetics, textiles, and many other types of products. So in the PFAS movement, we are working towards banning all these as a group. So yeah, like I just mentioned, our goal with this initiative is to ban PFAS as a group. And these 3 points that you see on this slide are what unifies the companies within the movement. So all companies recognize that PFAS is a major health and environmental problem. All companies support a group ban on all non-essential PFAS uses. And all companies have an ambition to phase out all non-essential PFAS uses, already have phased it out, alternatively have never used it. And Jonathan will circle back to the concept of essential use shortly. Next slide, please. Okay, on this slide, you see some of the companies in the movement. We are 74 now, to be exact. And it's a great mix of both smaller European companies and larger global ones. And it's also a mix of both retailers and manufacturers. And there's a wide variety of sectors, but the largest ones are textiles, cosmetics, and kitchenware. Now I leave the floor to you, Jonathan. That will give us an update of what's happening in legislation and what states we need to be aware of.
Thank you, Josefin. So I will just give a brief overview of all because there are a lot of different initiatives regarding PFAS, especially in European Union. That's where the focus we have. So I just wanted to give you that overview of the different initiatives, especially the broad PFAS restriction that might be, or that's the one, our main focus. But one could say that there are 5 different PFAS legislation initiatives. And I think it's important to stress that there are the pressure from policymakers regarding PFAS is very large. We see that at ChemSec, there is a lot of discussions at PFAS, but there is also a lot of discussions regarding PFAS at companies. So there is really an increased awareness on this issue that's coming for the last years, I would say. So there are restriction or some legislation, different legislations regarding the sort of old PFAS chemicals like PFOA and PFOS, but there are also regulations regarding some of the newer versions. So I will go through all of these different ones. So the first steps regarding the PFOA, PFOS is what's historically called the C8 chemistry, meaning that the PFAS substances consist of a carbon chain with 8 carbon atoms. And these are now regulated in the POPs regulation, the persistent organic pollutant regulation. and that came in force last year, or now it's almost 2 years, so 1.5 years ago. And that also includes related substances to PFOA and PFOS, without really giving a list of those substances. So there are estimations that can be between 500 and 1,000 different substances that's related to PFOA and PFOS, and therefore should also in many cases be restricted and regulated. So that was the sort of the first step regulation wise. And the second step was regarding the C9, C14 PFAS substances, so the long chain PFAS. And this is 6 different, so it's C9, C10, C up to C14. But that also includes related substances, which are estimated to be around 200, can be more. And this regulation will come in force next year, in 1 year, almost exactly, so February in next year. There will be a few exemptions with a later date for specific uses. Coming from that, we're moving to the short chain PFAS substances. So we have now regulated C8 and C9 and up to C14, so up to 14 carbon atoms in the polymer chain or in the chain. But the C6 chemistry, meaning the short chain PFAS substances, will also under proposed to be regulated. Also including related substances. In this case, the list contains of 94 substances. So in total, we already have regulated or will regulate quite a lot of substances within the PFAS family. Regarding the C6 PFHXA, which is a very complicated name, the ECHA, which is the European Chemicals Agency, is now finishing that work, and the proposal will come fairly soon. And our estimation is that they will be regulated in the same way as the long chain PFAS. In addition to this, we also have a regulation coming up regarding firefighting foams and PFAS in firefighting foams. And this will be sort of the first example of a group restriction regarding PFAS, because that will encompass all PFAS within the use of firefighting foams. And the proposal that came from ECHA, it came last month, is that it came in January, so 2 months ago now, is that we will have an 18-month transition time. And during that time, everyone will have to phase out the use of PFAS in firefighting foams. It will be done stepwise. After 6 months, only some uses will be allowed, and so on. There will be a consultation, meaning that the ECHA will get replies and comments this year. Will start in March and last for 6 months. And ECHA has also said that the results and the feedback from this consultation will be used as a feed-in to the broad restriction of PFAS, which I will talk about shortly. Now we've moved from restricting just a few substances up to maybe 100 or 200, and in firefighting foams it's a smaller group. And now we're talking about the broad PFAS restriction, which is proposed by 5 different member states, and it's a very ambitious approach, which actually the ambition is to phase out to restrict all uses of PFAS in all different kinds of products. And PFAS, the definition of PFAS within this restriction is basically a CF2 group, meaning that all kinds of PFAS will be included, including fluoropolymers and also smaller molecules. So it's a very ambitious approach. And it's 5 member states that's responsible for this restriction, which is quite a few for a restriction. So it's Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands. And there has been some call for evidence, and there has been some information gathering and as consultations. And right now, the member states are summarizing the information, which they will send to ECHA in January next year. The plan was to do that in June this year, but they postponed that one. So probably it will be in January next year. So what is the timeline for this? Because I think that this restriction is the one that will have impact on all kinds of companies, because PFAS has so many different functions and uses. So I think that probably most companies around will be affected by this restriction. So basically, as you can see, we're now at in 2021, last year, we had a stakeholder consultation, and that information is now gathered and will be submitted to ECHA in early next year. And after that, ECHA will have 18 months to do their work. So sometime during 2024, they will submit the proposal to the Commission. There will be a consultation on that, but probably we will have some kind of proposal from ECHA to the Commission in 2024, meaning that hopefully we'll have a decision of a restriction in probably 2025 or maybe sometime after that. So even though that this process has been slightly postponed, we see from the other restrictions that we are restricting the use of PFAS, and the EU wants to restrict the use of PFAS, which means that we should probably consider that PFAS will be restricted even in this broad restriction or in this broad way. There will of course be some exemptions, but as a company, it's important to know that you will have to in some way be a bit proactive and understand how PFAS is used in your products and how you can phase them out, because the legislation will be there in a few years' time. Connected to PFAS is also the concept of essential use, which is mentioned when discussed PFAS in the chemical strategy from the European Union. And the concept of essential use is that PFAS should be phased out for all uses that are not essential. And of course, that raises the question, what is an essential use? So that's also a work that's being done right now. There is a workshop regarding essential uses this week. I think it's Thursday. And the idea is that criteria for what is an essential use should be proposed at the end of this year already, which is also a very ambitious timeline. But I think that the work has been initiated and it's progressing, so I think that might be possible. And of course, this will also have great impact on different companies, because if some uses are deemed to be essential, then that will face less restriction from PFAS. But of course, if you have a product which is not an essential use, then you will be part of the broad PFAS restriction, and the use of PFAS will not be allowed. So just briefly, what I would say is the most important messages to sort of remember regarding PFAS, and if you're as a company, that we see now that PFAS are being restricted. We see several that's already restricted. We see several groups and substance examples being proposed for restriction, and we see that the broad PFAS restriction is moving ahead, and that will probably end up with a proposal and a decision from the Commission in a few years' time. So I think it's important to know that, because that leads to the second point here, that we need, in order to future-proof that your business, you need to really consider where PFAS is used in your products, and you need to already start now to be proactive with phasing them out and understanding how can we make products without using PFAS, because that will be very important already in a few years' time. But of course, this also means that you need to have knowledge both regarding PFAS and also regarding where those uses are. And I should mention that we, as I think Josephine has been sending mails, we are doing a PFAS guide where we will try to compile a guide for how to identify PFAS uses, and also giving some guidance regarding how to do the phase-out work, how to communicate around the phase-out work to suppliers, and how to think about testing for PFAS, for example. So I think that was my part of this presentation. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, great. Thank you, Jonathan. That was great. We have some really good answers, I think, in the Q&A. So I'll just start For PFHXA, I understood that the aim is to be in force 2023. Are there any news on eventual transition time discussed?
There are a few exemptions from the restriction. A few uses that will have longer time before the restriction comes in force. Some of them have an extra year. I think there is in the restriction there is a list of these exemptions. I don't remember exactly which they are, but it's quite small exemptions from the use. So I think it's in general one can say that there are a few exemptions, and they give very short time in sort of extra time for those uses.
Okay. Is there any news? Are there any news on the eventual inclusion of PTFE in the legislation?
In the broad PFAS restriction, PTFE is included in the definition of PFAS. All the fluoropolymers will be part of the PFAS restriction. So PTFE as a substance will definitely fall under that PFAS restriction. Then of course there can be essential uses in some cases of PTFE or other types of exemptions, but in general it will be included in the broad PFAS restriction. And I think that it's worth already now thinking about how to phase out and substitute PTFE, because it's many uses will not be considered essential, and therefore they will be in part of the restriction.
Great. Okay, for C9 to C14, what are the most common use for this type?
The long chain ones, I think that as with all PFAS, I think there are a lot of different uses. I cannot say exactly. I know that for many of the classical uses like water repellency, the short chain ones has been more prominent. So I cannot give exactly examples of the most common uses. I think that they are less used than the short chain ones. So this restriction is therefore I think easier to implement. But I also think that there are a lot of important uses within the C9 and C14, and I think that we are still we're still looking at a lot of data gaps regarding uses. So I think that even if we believe that we don't use it or it's not used that much, it will probably be a lot of uses that will be required to find new alternatives when C9 or C9 to C14 is phased out.
Okay.
Yeah, I can take the chem hours question. Yes, so yes, chem hours has lost its legal battle in the EU to remove its Genix chemicals. So how will that be impact on the general PFAS restriction? That's basically the question. So I think that this is this has been a case of industry trying to overrule the inclusion of a specific chemical to the SVHC list, so the substances of very high concern. I think that it will probably not impact that much on the general PFAS restriction, but I think it's a very important way where we see that even if industry is very prone to have an sort of, they want of course less restriction because it makes it easier for businesses, but what we see here is that when things are restricted or banned or added to the SVHC lists, it's done because of a reason, and that reason is that it's scientifically investigated and it's found to be or have hazardous properties. And I think that this is a very good case where you can see that if it's done properly, then it will not be able to you will not be able to have a legal battle and to get another result. You will have the same thing. So I think it will be it's a very good way of showing that where the EU process is working, and it's probably will be hard to do some other legal battles regarding the PFAS restriction exemptions, for example. But of course, then we're also looking at new definitions, like what is an essential use and what's included in that. So there will probably be other things that will be contested in a legal way, but in this way, I think this is very only positive for the further PFAS restriction work.
Okay, we have 3 more. I hear conflicting voices as to whether the essential use concept will already be applied to the PFAS restriction. What's your take? The essential use concept will replace the cost-benefit analysis. Yes. Does this mean that the cost for health and environment will not be considered anymore?
I think that regarding essential use, a lot is still rather unclear. As I said, there will be a workshop regarding this this week, where we hopefully will get more sort of hands-on what the criteria will be and how the Commission plans to work to go ahead with that discussion. My take is that the essential use concept will be applied to the PFAS restriction. That I definitely think, because there is a lot of time to find these criteria for essential use before the PFAS restriction work is done. And I think that it will also be important, because you need to define the essential use in order to understand which uses that should be restricted and which should not be. But I also think that the cost for health and the environment will be considered as well. I think that we will have a combination of the essential use, but also we might still have some remnants from the sort of older system with different costs, like for the SEAC analysis and things. So not really sure. I think it's next week we can probably have a better answer on that after the workshop. So if you're interested, I just send an email and I can follow up with you. I think it's Oliver that sends posted that question. Yeah.
But there is another one related to that too. Is there not a threat if the essential use assessment substitute the socioeconomic analysis? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the threat. I mean, if we're looking at the threat as the problem with essential use allowing a lot of different uses, I think that what we would like to see is a very strict definition of essential use, because that will make it easy for further discussions and further decisions regarding that. If we have a loose definition of essential use, it will be very hard for both companies and for the legislators to know how to move forward. So I think we need that a strict definition, because then we can have it will be much easier for companies to really know what to do, because otherwise it will just be very hard to understand. And regarding the if it substitutes the SEAC, the socioeconomic analysis, as I said, I'm not really sure that it will completely substitute that. We will still have the sort of authorization part of the REACH legislation, probably less important. We'll probably have more of these restrictions as we see now, and less of the work or the historical work with SVHCs and authorization. So I'm not really cannot say anything direct regarding that, and I think I can follow up with the Euro regarding this if you're interested. And I also can ask my colleagues who will attend the essential use workshop on Thursday to follow up with you if you're more interested.
And this is related to the PFAS guide, I think, that we discussed. Did I understand you correctly that you will provide a detailed summary that we could ultimately share with suppliers in order to identify products that need to be phased out?
Yeah, that's correct. We will try to have a guidance for how to identify uses, and then, of course, from uses identify products or product group that might contain PFAS. And we will also try to include a way of how to communicate with that with your suppliers, and which questions you should ask, and which tests that should should be a part of that. So yes, on that question. And I also should say that we're happy to get input on that. If you're interested, please contact us and we can follow up with you if you're more interested in that question.
And the last question, I think, we only talk about European restrictions and laws, right?
Yeah, that's correct. There is also a lot of, I should say, if we're looking at US, there is still a lot of state law regarding PFAS. And we also see that US EPA is much more interested now than they were a few years ago under the different administration regarding PFAS. It's something they've been looking at, and it's also in the Biden administration's chemical work to do something about PFAS. So there will probably be more PFAS globally as well, or more PFAS regulation. But what we see is EU is probably the most comprehensive chemicals legislation, and a lot of companies will have this as if they have to adjust to the EU law, and then they will have to adjust the global product line. So I think that's and also Chemsec is focusing on the EU, so that's why we're focusing on that part here.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Great timing and great questions and great answers, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we've reached the end of this webinar. Thank you to everyone who attended. Please follow us on Twitter and our new Instagram. And if you haven't done so, pop on over to our website and sign up to our newsletter. And please feel free to send us an email if you have any more questions. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.